Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. I think I'm going to talk mainly about some behaviour management issues today. I say I think because we'll see what happens. I would like to start, however, with a training session that I attended last week. I've been enrolled by my school on an SSAT, so that stands for the Schools, Students and Teachers Network, an SSAT Leaders for the Future course. And this training session comprised Module 1, so it was the first meeting of the year, and the title of Module 1 was Leading Yourself. The session objectives were as follows: to consider the importance of emotional intelligence for self-leadership and the leadership of others, to reflect on your own personality and consider how this impacts on both your own leadership and those you lead, to understand and recognise different personality traits, to explore a range of communication styles and consider the implications for leadership, and finally, to reflect on the impact your behaviours and actions have on others and how you are perceived. So it was a lot to get through in a couple of hours, but it was a very interesting session. There was one aspect, however, that I thought was a little bit, if not misguided, maybe a little bit outdated. So throughout this session, we were discussing emotions and the effect that emotions can have on us and how we need to be wary of the effect that emotions can have on us and how we need to try and control how we react to our emotions so that we don't have emotional outbursts and end up making a bit of a fool of ourselves or perhaps not being the best leaders that we could be. And I think this idea is common in other, broader discussions as well. The emotions often get a bad rap. You've got reason and rationality on the one hand. That's all good stuff. And on the other hand, you've got these pesky emotions that just get in the way. Like I said, I think that's a bit of an outdated dichotomy. I read a book years ago called Descartes' Error by I think he's a neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio. And in that book, he told the story of this person, Phineas Gage. It's an excellent story, I do recommend it, who after an awful accident essentially had the part of his brain that's responsible for emotions blown out of his head. It's amazing that he survived. I do recommend you go and check out the story. But he had the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions blasted out of his head, and so essentially was no longer capable of experiencing emotions. Now, you'd think that might be a good thing if we assume that emotions just kind of get in the way and can cause problems. This guy, Phineas Gage, he can no longer experience emotions, so you think he'd be this cool, calm, collected, calculating, rational, reasonable person. And in fact, he couldn't have been further from it. He became incapable of making value judgments. He could no longer attach value to things. And if you can't attach value to things, either positive value or negative value, then you can't make any good decisions. And if you can't make any good decisions, then you can hardly be described as rational or reasonable or let alone wise. And so in fact we need our emotions. We need our emotions to help us attach value to things so that we can be rational, and reasonable. I said rationable. That was good. I like that word. I'll leave that in. So it's a bit of an outdated dichotomy. It's not that the emotions are bad and that reason is good. In fact, the two need to work together. The emotions need to be infused with reason, and reason needs to be imbued with the emotions. So that was one thought I had whilst being involved in this training session. Now, something else we did during this training session, we were asked to reflect on the following. How would you describe your personality? Are you an introvert or an extrovert? Are you more aware of different aspects of your personality in certain situations or company? What brings out the best in you, and what frustrates or irritates you? And I want to zoom in on that final question, what frustrates or irritates you? Because in the past couple of weeks at school, there have been a couple of occasions where I've found myself incredibly frustrated. Furious, in fact. And on both occasions, it was because a student was ignoring me. That, more than anything else, seems to really get under my skin. And if there ever was a time where your emotions can get the better of you, for me, that's it. If someone is ignoring me, I get really, really irritated really quickly. So with one student, they were facing the wrong way. They should have been facing me. They were turning round towards the back of the class, facing one of their friends. And I had to say their name, I think, 4 times before they turned around. And obviously, each time I had to say their name, I got angrier and I got louder. So that was infuriating. And then on another occasion, a girl had received a detention in one of my classes. Now, my new policy on detentions is I just see them as an opportunity to have a conversation. And once the conversation has been had, I don't see any real reason as to why the student needs to be kept any longer. As long as the conversation has gone well and the relationship has been restored. And so this girl had received a detention from me during the lesson. I asked her just to have a quick conversation with me at the end. And I could see her heading for the door at the end. And I thought, oh, she's forgotten. So I said her name a few times. And it turned out she hadn't forgotten, but she was ignoring me and she wanted to leave. And again, infuriated me that I was being ignored. I said her name several times, but she continued to ignore me. Which is, of course, poor behaviour, and it does need to be addressed. But at the same time, it made me get very, very angry very quickly. So for me, going back to that question from the training session, what frustrates or irritates you? Being ignored is really high up on that list, maybe even the highest. And I think the same might be true for other teachers. Well, I mean, I'll speak for myself first, and then I'll let other teachers decide whether this resonates with them. One of the reasons that I've gotten into teaching is because I did fairly well at school myself. And I think as a result, a large part of my self-worth and perhaps even my identity is built upon, being a bit clever. I enjoy academia. I enjoy studying. I enjoy having what other people might think of as, highfalutin conversations. But I enjoy those things. I'm a bit of a nerd as well. I love maths. I love philosophy. So academically speaking, I feel I'm fairly competent within that domain. So yeah, a lot of my identity and self-worth is perhaps built on this idea that, I'm cleverer than average. Whether it's true or not, that's kind of what I feel about myself. And that is perhaps also one of the reasons why I found myself in teaching, because I enjoy academia. But anyway, so I've got this inflated idea of myself. I think because I'm clever, I ought to be listened to. When I'm speaking, people ought to be paying attention, especially students. Because I'm clever, what I'm saying is worth hearing. So if I'm talking, you better be listening. And if you're not listening, I think it drives me mad because it calls into question, my self-worth and even my identity. Because it's built upon the idea that I'm clever. And if someone's ignoring me, then that's like saying, well, what you're saying isn't worth hearing. I think that's why it frustrates me so much. And so I think this training session It was a great opportunity to reflect on that, to reflect on the things that frustrate me and why. And given that I've now reflected upon it, I think I might be in a better position to be on guard against it in the future. And reflecting on it again here is going to help too. So next time a student ignores me, I can think, oh, this is one of those things. This is one of those things that really, really has the potential to make me very angry. And while I shouldn't be getting ignored because it is rude behaviour and that does need to be addressed, maybe I also overreact to that because a lot of my self-worth is based on the idea that what I have to say is worth hearing because I'm clever, whether that's right or wrong. So that was a very useful exercise, and I encourage you to do the same. What really frustrates you, especially in the classroom, and why? Now, speaking of being frustrated in the classroom, we've all been there. Perhaps you're in a lesson where behaviour isn't as good as you would like it to be. There's lots of little low-level pockets of conversation that shouldn't be happening because you've asked for silence, and you may have even asked for silence multiple times, and the noise level in the classroom is also fairly loud. So if you're going to be heard, you're going to have to raise your voice anyway, and so you end up shouting. You end up shouting at your class, and it's partly a combination of already being irritated because behaviour isn't as good as you would like, but also having to raise the volume of your voice just to be heard anyway. So you end up shouting, and it almost surprised you. You've just found yourself shouting, really. And students go quiet. Students fall quiet. And you think, well, that was good. I don't normally shout, but, I found myself shouting here for one reason or another. And the students have sat up, they've stopped talking, and we can return to the work. Students are following instructions. This is all good. And so you did a thing, and it was met with a positive consequence. You shouted, and you got the behaviour from the students that you wanted. And so perhaps that makes you more likely to do the same thing again. And it's a slippery slope towards being a regular shouter. And why not? Going back to my example, I managed to get the behaviour that I wanted. I wanted students to be silent and listening with a shout. So why not shout more often? It's effective. It works. If that's what you want, if you want students to be silent and listen and take you seriously, why not shout? Now, I think shouting does work in the way described, but it's only superficial. I think shouting can secure the behaviour that you want from students in the classroom, but I don't think that it secures it for the right reasons. So I think it's important to ask why students have responded in that way to being shouted at. And a lot of the time it might be because they're a little bit scared. They might be from a household where people shout at one another in order to control one another. And so they may have experienced trauma with regard to shouting. And you shouting at them now as the teacher is essentially piggybacking on that previous trauma in order to secure the behaviour that you want in the classroom. They might be sat there frightened, and that's why they're listening. In fact, often, if you shout and you scan your eyes around the room, there are some frightened faces. It's easy to see them. And that makes me a little bit sad. So shouting might work, but it only works in a very superficial way. If you dig a little deeper and think about why students are responding to being shouted at, then it doesn't work at all. I don't want my students to do the right thing because they're frightened of me. I want them to do the right thing because we have a good relationship and because they know it's the right thing. And if anything's going to spoil a relationship, then it's probably shouting in someone's face. And of course, there are lots of students who, if you shout at them, they'll just shout back anyway. So some students will shout back, and the students who don't shout back might be frightened. And they're doing what you ask them to do because they're scared of you. And that's certainly a suboptimal scenario, I think. So I guess that's a cautionary tale, I would say. It's easy to find yourself on a slippery slope to shouting because it does seem to work in a superficial way. At least quite often it seems to work in a superficial way. Don't do it. And I think that's all I have to say today. Before I go, my usual Patreon plea. This episode took a couple of hours to produce, and that's about average, and I aim to produce a couple of episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so £2 to £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And if you sign up on Patreon, you'll also gain exclusive early access to unedited videos of my recording sessions. So for example, this episode took around 23 minutes to record, but the final episode that's published is likely to be around 16 minutes long at my best guess. So there's an extra 7 minutes or so for this episode of content if you're interested in seeing me fumble around and trying to organise my thoughts. Then you can see that if you sign up on Patreon. I'm not sure why anyone would be interested in seeing that, but you know what? If you are, it's an extra little bonus if you do sign up on Patreon. And we will talk again in a couple of weeks' time. Bye for now. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you and talk again soon.